And I have a lot of young clients that are in their 30s that have saved well and themselves have pretty good financial habits, and they want to put their kids on a good foot forward, not necessarily for college, but to give their kid enough security to be able to go and make decisions and drive their life in a way that's not so dependent on short-term thinking, which, as somebody that teaches young people and pays attention to what 22-year-olds are focused on in their job offers, time and time again, the number one thing that they're telling me about when they tell me about their job offer is the pay rate. Mm-hmm. They're focused on the salary. And I'm not saying it's not important to make money. Salary can be meaningful, but when you're 22 years old, that first job, it's not about your salary. It's about your experience, right? You're learning. And to be able to give your child the ability to not have to take a job because of an extra $5,000 of salary in the job offer, but be able to think long-term about how that job impacts their skill set and what that means for their future, I think is meaningful.
Brent, I've got a real world example I'm going to throw at you. Well, I want you to tell me about your kid catching his first fish. Was it in your creek?
Yeah, no. So, this weekend, my wife and I took our two kids out to, there's a lake here locally that has canoes, like boats on the shore that are anybody can come and use them. So we decided, because if you have kids, you know that like making things easy is really important. And so the boats are right on the side of it. It's just a little shed, and the boats are there, and they have oars and life jackets. And so you can just go to the lake, grab the boat, put it in the water, get the kids in it, and get out there. And so we took both our kids, and my wife and I grabbed a two-person canoe and flipped it over into the water, got the kids in the middle, and we got out there, and I handed she was so mad at me for giving him a reel hook.
Is this on Saturday?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And I gave my son like a real fishing hook, cause, and she was so angry. She was like, why didn't you give them fake things? They're going to hurt somebody. And here we are in the middle of the boat. My 5-year-old daughter's fishing off one side and my son's fishing off the other. And I gave them spinner baits, which are, if you don't fish, they're like these little, there's this little flashy thing, and you throw them out and you reel them in, and they spin and they flash. And my son was doing a heck of a job casting this thing out. And he actually, 3-year-old son was casting out his spinner bait and reeling it back and caught a largemouth bass in the lake. So I was pretty proud of him. It was his first fish.
That's
my daughter was she's so competitive.
Is she?
She was like angry that she didn't catch a fish. Like the rest of the night I was like, how was your day? And she's like, I didn't catch a fish.
Yeah. So I don't think I've ever caught a bass in my life. My wife has a fear of fishing.
We've got to change that.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Fishing and I have a very, we've got some bad history. I'll get into that in a second. Let me explain my wife's unreasonable fear. She does not like being next to people who are fishing because she has this phobia of a hook getting caught in her mouth and someone casting the line. Yeah, casting the line, and then it like yanks her mouth and hooks her cheek. So she has that fear, and now that fear has kind of weighed on me. So now I'm a little paranoid around fishing.
Well,
hooks.
if you're squeamish, don't listen to this part, but let me quell that fear a little bit. I also fly fish, and in fly fishing, from time to time, you will some reason get, a hook in you, whether it's because the line's flying back and, somebody casts near you and their lure hits you. One guy I knew got it in the shoulder during a cast. I have gotten it in the hand before when I was taking a fish off the hook. And there's a trick where you get a thick piece of fishing line and you loop it and you put it around the hook. And if you push down on the lure the right way and somebody yanks on the line, it pops the hook right out. And it is about the moment before they pull that, line is a little nerve wracking.
I'm,
But it
I,
doesn't. It actually. It's kind of it's one of those things where you think it's going to hurt a lot, but it's actually like a relief, and so it doesn't hurt nearly as bad as you think. But right before they yank the hook out of your hand, you're a little anxious.
See,
So
I'd rather not have the hook on my hand, period. And the best way to do that is just to avoid fishing.
yeah, because it's
So
an inevitability. At
this
some point.
gets me to my.
I don't know about the mouth, but
I'll explain my history with fishing. So we're going to talk about kids today, kids and capital, and one of the things that I had growing up, and my dad instilled in me was work ethic. And at a very young age, he had me working on a campground for a local children's home that he worked for. It's out in Pleasant Plain, Ohio. And they have this campground there in this pond that all the surrounding farm fields would drain into. So for every now and again, the pond, and the pond was it was like in between a pond and a lake, so it was pretty sizable. So it was a drainage pond, and they had a ton of fish. They had carp and bass and bluegill that were in there, snapping turtles, all sorts of things were in this pond. And occasionally, after the farmers would fertilize their fields, you would get a lot of rain. And then the fertilizer, before it would penetrate into the soil, would just wash out into this pond, and they would have a mass die off. And this pond would just smell so
yuck.
bad. All the carp would die. They'd be like, I don't know. Do you know what a carp is? It's like this bottom feeder fish, and they get massive in size.
Yeah, they're made to get the grass.
Yes.
They eat all the
algae. Grass. They did a terrible job at that because this pond was always like super dirty, and you could see like a quarter of an inch down below the surface. You'd grow a third arm if you swam in it. Which I never did because I was afraid to swim in it. I get squeamish talking about it to this day. But anyway, I had my recollection of fishing. When I think of fishing, I think of just putrid, rotting fish. And I also think of my experience.
Thanks for that.
I'm sorry, man. It's just
I told the non-squeamish people to stop listening.
The other thing I think of when I think of fishing is bluegill, because that's all I would catch. I would go out, and my dad would take me out fishing, and my buddy, he loved fishing. They would always go fishing in the same pond, and the only thing we would catch is bluegill. And if you've ever caught a bluegill before, these are the slimiest, stinkiest fish, and they've got these spiny fins. So you would have to you would have to caress.
You'd have to
the
hold it
fish.
the right way.
Yeah, and these things they would be like cocked. So you would catch them, and they would be we don't have the cameras yet, but these things would be like shaped like a banana. Because they're just ready to spring. As soon as you touch them, they would start flapping real aggressively. And inevitably, trying to get these dang things off the hook, you would get stabbed by these fins. So you would have to take this fish, hold it by the line, and then just take your hand and just slowly, drag it down the line until you reach the fish's mouth, and then you would slide your hand over the fish's fins. And then you would finally get a good hold on it, and it would inevitably just be freaking out the whole time. So you're just praying to God that you don't get stabbed in the fingers. And every time I would get stabbed in the fingers, and I would draw blood, and I'm just like, I'm done. This fishing thing sucks. I'm not going to fish anymore. So everybody, you like to fish. There's another fella in our office that loves to fish, and you guys all have a great experience, and I'm happy for you. But you're going to have to claw out this. You're gonna have to trudge out this PTSD in me that stems from catching bluegill from this putrid pond.
Jeez,
working in.
You describe it so vividly.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, to bring this back to a point,
mm-hmm.
it really does demonstrate, and I think as parents, I'm thinking about this a lot. How do I help? How do I help teach my kids good money skills?
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine your dad took you fishing because he liked fishing. He wanted you to like fishing. And guess what? Now you hate fishing because of his, persistence, right? And it built clearly it built some level of maybe resentment in you, right? And so I as a money guy, I want my kids to be thoughtful with money. Right. Mm-hmm. And you often worry, how do I teach them those skills well without beating them over the head and making them remember something analogous to your so eloquently put fishing story. So,
But yeah, it's sometimes introducing your kids to things has unintended consequences. And that's sort of what we're here to talk about today. What we wanted to discuss was kids and capital, how to understand your children to the best of your extent, and then how to deploy your capital to support your kids for a fruitful future. And you and I have slightly differing opinions about this, and we're by no means like child therapists or psychologists, but I think we do understand people, and we both have kids, so we're able to draw from that experience. So, with that, I just want to welcome you to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm your host, Ben Jones,
and I'm Brent Gargano.
and today we're going to talk about kids and money. So, and with the fishing story, that's a kind of a good example. My dad was not a big fisherman. I do think he enjoyed fishing to some extent. I think he more enjoyed just the fact that I was there and I was part of his facility. So my dad managed a campground. Well, it wasn't just a campground. The campground was part of this facility, this children's home that he managed out in Pleasant Plain, Ohio. And part of that facility, you had this group of foster homes, but then you had this campground. And I think he liked me being in that campground because it just introduced me to a lot of life lessons, but also nature. And I was just close by, so he could keep tabs on me. So the fishing part, I do recall being with him when he would introduce me to fishing, but he wasn't so passionate about it that he would take me out and we would go on fishing trips and whatnot. So I don't want you to think that maybe he was.
That's what I'm so sensitive to. Like
Mhm.
with my kids, that's why I gave them a spinner bait, because I think like if I gave them worms and all that, my daughter wouldn't be like a spinner bait. You don't have to touch anything. You throw it out, you reel it in. I took the fish off the hook for him. He didn't want to touch it. He had so much fun until the fish was like in the boat.
I can relate.
And, but anyway, I dealt with all that. Like you want them, I think from my perspective, I want it to be a positive memory.
Yes.
And so, and for me, you kind of mentioned the fishing trips. When I was a kid, my dad, at least when I was old enough, we would actually set up fishing trips where a guide would take you out. And, it's certainly not cheap to hire a guide, but it's a lot cheaper than buying a boat and having all, and it's, by the way, it's a lot easier. So you end up, instead of going out there and having to deal with the boat and getting tangled and what do you use for bait, it's like the guy brings the boat, the guy brings the bait, the guy brings the rods, he untangles everything. If you break a rod, it's his rod. It's just so much easier.
Yeah, sounds like a better experience.
Yeah, and then turns out you grow up to enjoy fishing. And that, back to the money stuff, I think it's so related. Like, how do you reinforce positive money memories in your kids? And what got me thinking about this was, and for folks out there, we will probably have a follow-up podcast at some point, hopefully in the next couple of months, about the quote, Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is the literal name of the act as it's moving through Congress. And this act has, I guess my understanding is there's like 1,000 pages to this bill. It's chock full of stuff, but one of the things in there is tax policy, which is a big deal related to this sunsetting of the current tax code that happens at the end of this year that we've talked on and on about. But amongst the various provisions in this tax bill, there is this account that initially was termed the MAGA account. Now they're calling it the Trump account. And the idea is
that's bound to trigger.
I know this is, anyway, but
yeah,
apparently the way this is going to work, assuming that this gets passed the way that it is and whatnot, is that the government helps establish an account for your child when they're born. They seed this account with $1,000, and then you have some contribution limits to it. The money is invested. And then when your kid turns 18, they have access to the money. There's some tax benefits, and they can use it for more than just college. They can use it for starting a business, buying a house, going to school. And we've talked in the past about 529s and all these different ways to save for kids. So I thought this was maybe an interesting moment to revisit. Like how do we see successful clients saving for their children, and how should they be approaching
And
it?
it's not just clients saving for their children; it's children themselves too.
Sure.
So a couple this past week, it's been a kind of a theme, a motif, if you will. I've had a couple people pull me aside, more than a couple actually, and just say, "Hey, my son or my daughter have been working and they're living at home still. What should they be doing with all their money? They got too much money in their checking account." And I think you and I both agree that a checking or savings account at your local bank is one of the worst places to put long-term capital. The only place I can think of that's worse than that would be like cash in a safe, or Beanie Babies. There's obviously terrible places to park long-term capital. But what I'm trying to say here is that uh, checking and savings accounts, they're not going to help you maintain purchasing power, and they don't teach your kids anything beyond like, oh, I give my money to the bank and my account, grow. My account doesn't grow, but my balance grows as I put money in there. And that is a useful lesson to an extent, but you need to move beyond that
Well, I
eventually.
think one of the most
Mhm.
I assume I speak for both of this. One of the most common mistakes we see parents making for children is saving money in cash.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, opening an account, a custodial account at the local bank or a bank, hey, Johnny or Susie's checking account, and then just adding money to a checking account. I mean, it's not to say there's not a place for cash. Cash is short term capital. We want it there for short term goals. But if you're saving money for a 5-year old and you want them to use that money to maybe let's use the Trump account, buy a house, start a business, go to school,
Mhm.
um, should you be saving in cash? And I think resoundingly the answer is no.
Most of the time, not. Because if you're saving for your child, the only time I could think of where this is not the case is, let's say you just start saving and Johnny's 18 and Johnny's getting ready to go to university the next year. Obviously, you probably shouldn't be putting that money in the
Short
stock
term
market. Yeah,
goal, short term capital.
exactly. But most of the time when you're saving for your child, you're doing it in drips and drabs. You're doing what's called a dollar cost average. A dollar cost average is just an average monthly savings amount. And if you're doing that, you probably should be leveraging some form of investment plan. You shouldn't just be putting that money in a savings account where the bank gives you a quarter of a percent of interest. I don't even think you're getting that anymore in
No.
savings. It's like, I think I looked at my um, bank savings at my credit union and it was like 0.1%. Which is crazy because if you think about it, the federal target rate is four and a quarter to 4.5%. It's like, what do
We
you do?
You know they're lending it out for
Yeah.
mortgages, right?
It,
And a mortgage is sitting at what, 6 or
well,
7%?
I guess that's why JP Morgan stock is at all time highs. Yeah, it really is quite a feat, the type of returns. Have you seen JP Morgan stock relative to the S&P 500 over the past 5 years?
It's
Unbelievable.
done well.
Done very well. Banks in general have done well in this rate environment, and it's easy to see why when they can take on deposits and pay a fraction of a percent, and then go and park it risk free at the Fed or short term treasuries, or use the reverse repo facility. You're getting, it's basically free money. Now it's more complicated than that. But back to saving for kids. I think the first thing you need to do before you start saving for your kid is just understand them. And that's where you and I are not experts. Hopefully we can expand on this in another episode. Is just what are the right ways to talk with your child and get to know them a little bit better. I think that our generation of parents, um, they learned their lessons from the greatest generation, and that was kind of like parenting from a distance. They almost were afraid to they taught how in those military movies where you get the fresh round of new recruits and the veteran soldiers are afraid to make friends with them because they know they're just meat for the meat grinder. It's almost like the greatest generation. That's how they treated their kids because they're like, I could lose them, so I'm afraid to have a relationship with them. That's almost how it seemed. Their relationship with the kids was almost like uh,
Sounds like a
it was
sterile.
tenuous. Yeah, it was almost like they were treated like employees, if you will. They're your employees. Now, this isn't hugely true, but I do know that my dad's relationship with his dad was different than my relationship with him, and then my relationship with my kids. It's just over the generations, over these past 3 generations, the relationship has gotten closer and tighter. And I don't know what causes that, but I can tell you that with my parents, they just learned from their parents, and I don't recall my dad ever like really trying to get to know me. I think he just observed me from a distance, observed me from a distance and tried to coax me in the right direction, but only when I would approach him with questions. Whereas with my kids, I try to be much more intentional. Now, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. This is why I want to have an expert on to talk about it. But I try to seek feedback from my kids and ask them like open-ended questions. And one thing I do know is that, and I learned this from a child therapist. You want to ask your kids these open-ended questions when they're in a good mood, a good state of mind. You don't want to ask them these questions when they're in a moment of stress, which kids have a lot of. Like if they're really upset, or they're emotional about something. Now is not the time to sit down and say, "Tell me about your emotions." Why are you acting this way? You want to wait till they're, in a jovial mood, somewhat distracted, and then that's when you ask them these open-ended questions. Just get to understand them. So, for example, with my oldest son, he's 13, and he's reaching this age where he's starting to become interested in vocations. And I wanted to understand, okay, where are his interests? Can I rely on this guy for my succession plan? The answer is no, by the way. So
Well,
far. So he's really interested. He's very talented in three-dimensional art. He's very interested in construction. He alluded to me that he's interested in architecture. So that's kind of the route he wants to go in. But that clues me in on, okay, what should I be doing? Because another son, my third son, my youngest son, he's more interested in like construction. So he likes he likes building with his hands. He's going to be more of a vocational person. I'm going to keep an eye on him. But with Barrett, I know that it's very likely if he wants to pursue that career, I'm going to have to start saving for college education because that's not a cheap degree to get.
what are some
Mhm.
of the ways that so your kids are a little bit, well,
Mhm.
you have more kids than me, but you have some older kids than me. What have you done to teach your kids about money?
Yeah, that's something that you and I probably disagree on. I'm a big believer in UGMA or UTMA accounts. I know you don't like these things. And let me explain what they are. So these are accounts that they're literally your kids' accounts. So you're giving your kids money, or it's their own money. They can make deposits into these if they have earned income or birthday money or what have you. But they're essentially they're not IRAs. They're no different than your personal non-qualified accounts, except they're in your kids' names. And you, since they're not adults, they're not 18. You put your name as a custodian on them. So you control the money, but you are controlling your kids' money. It's not your money. That's where a lot of parents get confused, is they think that the UTMA account is still their money, but it's in their kids' names. It's like, no, no, no. You're acting as a fiduciary for your kids. So you can't be going and spending it on your stuff. I've seen some people not honor that. But
Now,
back,
the other side of that is any family with young kids can
Mhm.
probably justify a lot of expenses that are for the kids.
It's one of the areas that I see the most abuse. I can give you a story after I'm done
Well,
telling
but
you.
and let me also explain. So
Mhm.
there's a couple of reasons that these accounts are used. Primarily, it's just saving for kids, but the
Mhm.
incentive is there's a marginal tax benefit to it. So I think something like the first $2,000 of interest and gains are taxed at the child's tax rate.
Mm-hmm.
And kids' tax rate's typically lower than the parents' tax rate. So you get some small tax advantages. And of course, it's nice to say you have money set aside for your kids. But, and this is where we do disagree. I think just like everything that I talk about in the different episodes, I think it's really important to quantify the, monetary value of flexibility. And once that money's in your kids' accounts, I can say, speaking from experience, somebody that worked at Fidelity and talked to a lot of people, I have seen several situations where parent has more money in the UTMA account than because guess what? If you invest that money, turns out that a little bit of money goes a long way. You can end up with some decent money in these, UTMA accounts pretty easily.
I see, it's funny that you see that UTMAs are not flexible. I see them as more flexible. Your issue is you are losing control of that money. As soon as that kid's 18, it's their money. I see that as a positive. And if you think, well, this is where knowing your kid becomes very important. If your kid is, somewhat delinquent, not well behaved, you probably shouldn't use a UTMA. I'm very fortunate in I have 4 very wonderful kids. My wife to thank for that. She's an amazing mother. I don't see any concerns on the horizon with any of my kids. Now that could change.
So why do you think it increases your flexibility?
Because you're not locked into a certain thing. Like maybe this so-called MAGA or Trump account fixes this, but the problem with 529 plans is you have to use that for education. Well, what if my kids don't pursue an advanced degree, or they want to instead use the money to buy a new car? Maybe they get a scholarship or something. I think that 529 plans lock you into a goal that may not be appropriate. And if it becomes more appropriate, if it becomes appropriate to make a contribution to 529 plans, then you can use the UTMA money to do that. So you have more flexibility with the UTMA than you do with the 529 or Coverdell or anything, any other type of account.
Well, that's true, but I think that's not the comparison that I make.
Okay.
So what I tell my clients is that there's a couple of pathways to take. Of course, you can save in a 529. If you're not familiar with that, 529 is a college savings plan. The benefit is the money goes in, you still have a level of control, money grows tax-free, use it for school. Now, we've talked before on this podcast about 529s, and yes, they are less flexible, but there is a lot of legislation, or there has been a lot of legislation over the last couple of decades that's really increased their flexibility. So 529s are one way to save. UTMAs or UGMAs, that's the second way. That's what we've been talking about, where money is in the child's name, parent is the custodian, acts as fiduciary for the child. Advantages, small tax advantage, but disadvantages when your child turns 18 or 21, depends on the state, that money's theirs, right? I'm proposing a third option. And this is what I do for a lot of the folks that I work with, is we actually set aside money in the client's name. So not in the kid's name, we actually just set up a normal investment account in the client's name. And then what we're able to do with the custodian is we can create what's called a friendly name on the account. So when the client logs in, even though the account is registered in the client's name, the label on the account may say, my 2 kids 50-50, or, child A, child B, whatever it is. And we can save money in that account. We can buy ETFs in that account. We can buy any kind of investment in that account. And the way that the gifting limits work, at any point in time, if you have a married couple, you can hand that child in 2025, it's $38,000 a year out of that account. So when that kid turns 18, if I want to give them some money, I can very easily take $38,000 of appreciated stock, give that to my child. And then one other thing we've talked about with tax planning is there is a 0% long-term capital gains tax bracket. If your income is low enough, you have a 0%. So potentially the child could sell that same stock at a long-term capital gain and pay 0% federal income tax. So my argument is that retaining the control, even if you don't do it in a college savings account, and I think that's where I fall, is what I spend a lot of time asking clients is, how intent are you in saving this money towards college and education versus how much do you want to have money set aside to empower your child to do.
It's hard to
more
feel
with themselves.
empowered when it's not your money, though. And that's where my issue is. Like, your strategy works.
Well, that's fine. And if they're 18 years old and I need to give them money, I mean, I don't think there's any challenge in getting them a sizable amount of money.
Let me make this really real for people and why I use UTMA accounts. And I'm not poo-pooing I do this with a lot of clients. Most of the time, when your kid's a little bit unwieldy, you need to maintain that control of the capital. You don't want to have a child that is in and out of juvenile detention center, having hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's obviously a recipe for trouble, but most kids, that's not the case. Most kids are pretty well behaved. They're well structured. I like giving my kids responsibility, and I like it to be irrevocable for me.
Well, that's fine. But if your 18-year-old has $50,000 and they're a nice kid, but they aren't good with money, do you think that $50,000 is going to help them build better money skills, or do you think it's going to hurt them?
Absolutely. Yes.
I don't know.
I agree 100%.
So what I'm trying to say is, I think it's important that you have a level of recourse. What I've seen, and this is just experientially, was the clients that were in a situation where they didn't want their kids to get the money, but the money was there and the kids were aging into getting the money. The scary part was, because they couldn't control the money, but they still wanted the control and saw the control as important, they started to try to control in other ways. And it wasn't a good thing, right? Because they all of a sudden they don't have, the kid has money. So what do you do to the kid as, quote, punishment? And I'm not saying that you should punish the kid. I'm just saying that these situations and these incentives, they start to matter. And I understand that, your kids may be great kids, and I'm not trying to insinuate they're not great kids. I'm just trying to say,
I think you are.
No, I'm just trying to say that
I'm messing.
It just like any kind of, if you get into business with another person, right, it's great. How many people get into business with a friend? I have a great friend and we want to go into business together. Well, once you're business partners and you've got capital that's sunk together and you're in each other's pocket, right? It changes the relationship in a way that you have to be aware of. And I think that if you ignore that inevitable shift in the relationship, it's really, it can have consequences. The same thing for the kids. I just think an 18-year-old, whether good, bad, well-intentioned or not, having, unfettered access to potentially tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars.
There is a limit that's reasonable. I will grant you that. You don't want to have generally someone have so much money where their life is just too easy to live on cruise control, and they just hit the easy button. But I think I think it's important for kids to have a reasonable amount of capital at their disposal so they learn very important lessons early on in life.
And again, I'm not advocating that they don't. I think it's really important, especially for the parents that set up accounts in the kid's name. I think it's great to communicate, hey, I have money set aside for you. Let me show you what it's in.
Well, Brent, can I just, I'm going to go over my real world value add for the UTMA account. These are examples. All right. So my son, Luke, he's displayed a lot of interest in money. He's a very entrepreneurial minded person. We were just at church the other day, and it was our turn to do the coffee bar. And I brought him up. We have to wake up early. We got to go to the building, make the coffee before everybody shows up. And he's there helping me with it. And he says, Dad, should I put a tip jar out and say tips for Luke? Of course, I didn't let him do it, but he's just always thinking about, how do I make a buck? So he's very industrious.
He's enterprising.
Yeah, he's enterprising. So, he shows a lot of interest in investments. He's always asking me about his account, not my account for him, his account, his money. How do I add exposure to this company? He actually personally asked me to buy some Roblox stock for him, which he has done really well on, by the way. But he wanted to buy Xbox stock, Roblox stock, and then Xbox being Microsoft. And he's bought a couple other things. He's asked for my advice. He's 10 years old. 10 years old. And it's just been a
I
great
love
life
all
lesson.
of that.
Yes.
I think all of that is great.
Now, all my kids have this account. My son Barrett, he's less interested in the details, but he knows his account is growing. And sometimes he'll get money for Christmas or his birthday, and he doesn't want to buy anything. So he'll ask me. I said, "Well, you should probably invest some of it." And then he'll give me cash. He'll say, "Here, invest this for me, Dad." And then we talk about that, and it becomes their money. I can't stress this enough. It's important that they know that this money is theirs. And I know this money has gravity. You know it too. That's what you sense. That's what every parent sense. That's why they want to control it. They want to control it for their kids because they don't want their kids to screw it up and lose it. But what I think it's important to do is that, that it's their money and they understand how important it is. And yes, you give them the freedom to screw it up. And that's going to be painful to watch. Out of my four kids, one of them is going to be moronic with this money. But I would rather them be moronic with that money at 18, 20 years old than to learn this hard lesson at 35.
Well, I hope your reaction, it's not them being moronic that is normally the problem. It's your reaction to them. It's what do you do when you see them being moronic with that money to try to correct them when you don't have the ability to correct them?
Barring it, the only thing that gives me the fear of God is like, drug, alcohol related problems. Substance abuse problems, that really is something that I'm afraid of, and that's something I'm going to be paying very close attention to. And I think this is where a behavioral expert input would be valuable. But my approach to that potential problem is just to be very aware of who my kids are surrounded by, what they're doing, what their habits are. Just pay attention. Don't be negligent. Don't sleep on your job. So be a parent, in other words. So, that's really the only thing that I'm afraid of. But if I have a son that comes to me, and I've had this happen, like, who was I just meeting with the other day? It was someone. Oh yes, I remember. This particular individual, they're having difficulty with their daughter going into a university because that what they want to do is not necessarily college. They're kind of like one of these meandering youths that really just doesn't know what they want to do, so they just graft onto what they see online. They want to become an influencer. That's kids that don't have a clue of who they are. They want to become what they see, and what they're constantly bombarded with, especially if they're glued to like Instagram or TikTok or these influencers, because they look like they're just getting flooded with praise and attention and easy money. So of course, who wouldn't want to be that? What they don't understand is that's a very difficult career path, one, because everybody's trying to get into it. And two, it's just like, I can't imagine it being that rewarding, because it's ultimately, a bit toxic, I think. It's a bit toxic in the sense of its narcissism. So, anyway, this is what's happening with this daughter. So she's seeing like, all these influencers. Of course, she wants to become a model. All right. She wants to become a model. So now there's literally an entire cottage industry, Brent, built to prey on these individuals, where now you can, like, for a small fee, of course, you can learn how to be an influencer. And now this is what this person wants to do. And they're coming to, mom and daughter are coming to a head. It's actually creating a lot of consternation. So, my opinion is, I personally gave my advice, and the advice is not necessarily being followed. But I think that it would be important for this daughter to learn the lesson now. Go ahead and invest this capital of yours, that is your money, This is your pot of money. So here's the balance that's in your name. And then when you go and spend it on this certain thing that you think you want, but really it's a waste of money. And I'm telling you, it's a waste of money. When you come out of that, you're going to realize, oh, my account's lower and I don't have the skill set. Looks like mom was right. And I think if you get out of the way, you don't create a battle. You don't be confrontational about it. You just say, I advise that you do this. This is the logical course of action to take. I will support you in whatever you choose to do, so long as it's healthy, and it's not, going to harm you physically or mentally. Then I support in what you're going to do, even though you know it's a waste of money, because it's an important lesson.
And by the way, you
Mhm.
can do all of that
Mhm.
with an account in your name.
No, you can't.
Yes, you can.
No, you can't, because you will not allow it, because you're a control freak. So if you keep that money in your name, you have not relinquished control.
No,
You,
I think you are, and you like to do it. You don't give clients credit for their own ability to make good choices, right? And I think I don't know if that was a personal shot at me, because I wouldn't support it.
Mhm.
I think you can make the active choice to let your kid make a mistake. Okay, what I'm not saying here is don't ever give your kid money. Okay,
Mhm.
I actually help clients give kids a lot of money.
Mhm.
And we a lot of times are able to do it in a very tax efficient way with, I mean, I don't know too many families that I talk to that want to give their kids more than $40,000 a year, right? And that's the limit, basically. I mean, $38,000 a year is the gifting limit right now. And sorry, I should explain it.
Mhm.
$19,000 per person giving a gift, per person receiving a gift.
Mhm.
So if you have a married couple giving a gift to a child, you have 19,000 times 2 for the parents
Mhm.
giving. Now, if you have married couple giving to married children, you can actually now multiply that a couple extra times. You can
Mhm.
give, what would that be? 76,000,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
So the limits on how much you can gift your kids at any point in their life are pretty generous. And what I'm advocating is not that you be a miser and never support your kids in making mistakes and don't let your kids go down the right path. What I'm also presenting is not don't let your kids see the account and don't let them be involved in decision making in the account. All of these things can be solved through technology. View access is very available on these accounts. The names on the accounts can be set up in such a way that the kid, when they log in, doesn't even see your name. They can invest in whatever stocks they want, fractional shares, individual companies. The money can be gifted through a simple journal online when the time is ready. Like all of that could be accomplished through the framework that I'm kind of talking about. You just and I'm not saying that you should fully control everything. All I'm saying is that when you guarantee that you will have no control, right? Then if you do decide you want control for whatever reason, and I'm not trying to justify or get hard on what that reason might be, you are going to have to reach for other levers. And if you don't have the financial lever, what do those other levers look like? And I'm not, this is not a me thing. This is, I have talked to people in this situation, and it's a weird conversation. And so generally speaking for me, and I'm all for, hey, if my kid gets some tips or sets up a business, I want him to have an account to deposit some money into. And, I don't want my kid to be debanked. That's fine. Okay. But when we're talking about real money, and I think we should get into here, like how easy it is to actually get your kid pretty wealthy early on through the power of compounding interest, right? Like when we're talking, let's say tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, like there are some big implications with that are beyond like, I want to support my kid having a tip jar, right? And so I'm all for all the things you said about your kids and supporting the investing. And I think it's actually really important to do individual stocks with kids. One of the things that I talk to with my adult clients is avoiding individual stocks, because a lot of times, once you buy them, you don't know when to sell them, and they have these like diversified funds have so many benefits. But for children, the idea of buying the S&P 500 is not nearly as fun as the idea of buying Roblox,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
It teaches them important, like, economic lessons. Like, what is the S&P 500? It that actually is something. It's not just this ethereal, like,
But like
thing
for
that you
me,
buy.
I got interested
Mhm.
in investing when I was like 18, 19 years
Mhm.
old. And when I started saving money and buying stocks, like, and I don't really
Mhm.
buy individual stocks today, but back then I was excited about the idea of buying Apple stock. I mean, it was something I used every day. And so I felt connected to it. And I felt
Mhm.
like that was really neat. I remember in college, I had a shopping list for stocks that I wanted. And it was kind of how I encouraged myself to make more money to then go buy the stocks that were on my list. Right. So anyway, the point is, I think what people listening to this need to hear is that there are a lot of parents out there, either one, saving too much money in cash for their kids, and two, a lot of them aren't saving because they don't understand how they can save. They're not doing the college savings because they're worried about the the fact that it's not flexible. For those speaking to those parents, recognize that there are rules that allow you to get the money out for scholarships, for military, for vocational schools. You can now put money in a Roth IRA for that child if you don't end up using it. So there are outs. For the parent that doesn't want to save for college in particular, recognize that you can easily set up money, segregate it from your own money, whether it's in your child's name or in your name. That's the debate that where we disagree slightly. But the point is, segregate that money, make sure that if it's long-term money, you've got it invested in long-term instruments, and start to think about how does that, I mean, clearly, Ben, you've spent time thinking about how do you define success for that money for your kids,
Mhm.
even if that success isn't rooted in them making good decisions with it.
Yeah, it's what this money is designed to do is not necessarily make them wealthy. It's to well, in an indirect way it is. What this money is designed to do in my mind is educate them, to give them lessons. And I can't stress enough how much how important it is to put it in their name. I know you're hung up on this. You're like, "Wow, I can't do it. I can't have my kid
I'm
have
happy to
control."
add.
It's like
I'm
that's
happy
the
to have
point.
their names can be on the account when they log in. They can see their
It's
name
not
right
their
there.
money. It's not the same. You
You
are
think a kid understands the difference of what's on
they're
the
not going I can guarantee they won't if you don't put it in their name. Because it's mom and dad's money. They need to understand, and you need to teach them this is your
So how
money.
much money do you think is too much money? Where like
Well, for
I can follow your logic
yeah.
for a few $1,000, maybe even 20, $30,000. Like at
Mhm.
what point does that become
How much is too much money?
yeah.
I do think that's a reasonable question because you could put too much. There is an amount that's stupid that you shouldn't put into a kid's mouth. So how expensive should the lesson be? I think it depends on what the family can support. For example, like if you're a multi millionaire, you know, and your kid's accustomed to that lifestyle you've given them, you need to you need to accommodate that child's UTMA with that commiserate level of support. I don't live that kind of lifestyle, so what would be too much for my kids? I'd say probably anything north of 50,000 would be too much. But I also think that that amount is a moving target. It's going to change. Now, I do want to acknowledge that the advice that you're giving is very, very reasonable. And for a lot of people, that's going to be the advice they need to follow. For the people that can't stomach the idea of not having the control, like you mentioned, what other levers are you going to pull? Here's my answer, Brent. None. None. Because at that point, my kid is their own adult. I'm not going to pull any levers unless it is something related to substance abuse or something that is immediately dangerous to their well being.
So how much
Um,
money? Well, your answer was how
mhm.
many dollars? That's
Well,
just
I,
to be
I just
clear.
pulled it out of the sky. I actually haven't really thought about it. I'd say if the accounts had, and they're not gonna, I'm not putting enough money in these things for them to get to 50,000. But
Well,
if
this
it,
is my point because
yeah,
really, when you talk about saving for your kids, I mean, I think we're
hmm
talking about two different things in the sense that
hmm
you're talking about money habits for kids. And I think that's
hmm
really important. I'm talking about saving for education, houses, businesses. What house is your kid buying with an extra? I mean, college costs, we looked it up before this. The average public in-state tuition across the country is something like between tuition, room, and board.
Well, I just looked at my university, and it was my alma mater is now $95,000 a year to go to.
And the average public in-state, and by the way, that's just tuition, right? That doesn't
that includes room and board.
That includes
Tuition
room and
is
board.
70 grand.
So the average public, according to this Peterson statistic that we found, the average public in-state school between tuition, room and board, book supplies, almost $30,000 a year.
It's a scare tactic. All right.
Regardless,
I hear this all the time. How many times have we been doing financial plans for clients? Like, yeah, there are people out there that truly do pay that, but most of the time people don't pay sticker price.
Okay, for what reason?
Well, either they get scholarships, or they're getting, Stafford loans. Now technically they are still paying the sticker price.
But if you want to, if the goal here, and in my mind, this episode is about how do I save for my kids so that I can have money available for them so that I can pay for their college. I don't want them. Maybe you want them taking student loans. I'm just saying, if you want to save for their college, do you want them taking? But you're talking about $50,000. All I'm trying to say is, I'm talking bigger dollar amounts, right? I'm talking about $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. When you think about what you're going to have saved, if you have I'm just doing some math here. If you took the $29,000 roughly cost of attendance for public in-state schools in 2025, and you inflated it out at 4% for a newborn today, their schooling is going to cost about $220,000, right? So we're not talking about saving $20,000 for your kid or $30,000 for your kid. We're talking about almost saving $250,000 for your kid.
Yeah.
Right? To fund college. I'm not saying that has to be the goal. I'm just saying that for a lot of my clients, they want their kids to have a material enough amount of money to start a business, buy a house, go to college. And by the way, it's actually not that hard to get there. Just using that same example of a kid that's newborn today, cost of college is $29,000 all in. 18 years later, you need about $250,000 to fund it. The math actually backs up to be that you need to save roughly $6,000 a year at an 8% rate of return and 4% college inflation. But the point is, you don't have to. You're not talking about, let me save, $25,000. This is $500 a month. Hey, let me put $500 a month away for my kid.
Here's the problem
and their future.
The average household can't afford that, for one, because you're talking usually 2, sometimes 3 kids. And the household that can afford that, or they're on an income trajectory where they can't afford that, by the time they get to that college goal, they could just cash flow. So the 529 plan, I'm not a massive fan of the 529
So what
plan.
do you tell a client? What do you tell a client when they have a newborn and they say, I want to save for my kid's future? Do you say, no, don't worry about that? Because by the time, now I'm not advocating necessarily for the 529, right? Because again, back to my point, you can save that money in your own brokerage account. You can gift that. The gifting limits would very easily cover any college tuition. By the way, if you write the check directly to the school, you don't even have to count it towards the gifting limits. So you have all sorts of flexibility to pay this with your regular brokerage account. So all I'm trying to do when I give you that example is give a measuring stick to, hey, I don't know what you might want to use this money for, but hey, if you were saving for full ride college, you're probably talking about trying to set aside, let's say $200,000 to $250,000. Now, I'm perfectly happy for any client to say, hey, I really want my kid to earn more of their own way, and so I want to save less of that. Or vice versa. They want to say, hey, I really want to make sure that I can not only set my kid up for college, but maybe do some other things for them as they're trying to get into their life. Because whatever it is, I'm just kind of holding up a measuring stick and giving you that $200,000 number. Again, with the whole argument being, I'm fine with you having a UTMA account if all we're talking about is your kid has $10,000. But for young families that have kids and they have and to your point, as long as they have the cash flow to save for these kids, they could potentially have a lot more money than that sitting in these accounts. It doesn't take that much. I went back and ran the math on this. if you look at just the S&P 500
Mhm.
from 2000 to 2018. Okay, so this math is all based on start date of January 2000 and end date of January 2018. 18 years, again, kind of lining up with the college. If you just saved $100 a month, you started with zero, and you saved $100 a month in the S&P 500. By the time your kid turned 18, they have $54,000, right? So to get to your number is a fairly low bar. And I'm perfectly happy if you want to have a UTMA with 10, 20,000 bucks in it. A lot of my clients are saving 500 plus dollars a month for their kids. And we want to make sure that, well, I just think when an 18-year-old has unfettered access to 100 plus $1,000, while I understand your answer, I have seen it blow up. So,
I have too, but it blows up it blows up for the reasons that you're not thinking of. It blows up for reasons that are preventable, I think. And as long as you're taking the necessary steps to prevent those reasons, if you're using the accounts as an educational device and you have come to peace with the terms that you're going to lose control over that money when you're 18, when your child is 18, but you also have confidence that your child is going to make wise choices. And by the way, wise choices doesn't mean that they're not going to blow the money. Yeah, they're going to do something stupid with it, but it's going to be a lesson learned. Also, I do want to comment real quick on 529 plans. All right, because having 4 kids, I have a little bit of experience here. Not all your kids are the same, and I think it's very important to maintain an egalitarian household, because if you don't keep things fair, your kids will hold that against you. That is a resentment they will harbor for their entire life. So, if you put in $200,000 into Johnny's 401k plan, but you notice that Elizabeth looks more like, she's going to be a hairstylist. So you put only like 10,000 in hers. What do you think that does? So that's psychologically very impactful for them. And it's going to create all these like tensions in the household for the rest of your life. And then also too,
yeah, even more reason, by the way, to keep your money in your own taxable brokerage account, so that as the kids' needs change and as they have different needs for the money, you can very clearly.
Well, yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that 529 plans are overrated is what I'm getting at. They're good for a portion. So
I think they're really good early on, because when you have like a kid who's 1 to 5 years old, your ability to get information as far as how they're going to be at 18, 1, is pretty limited. And 2, the biggest benefit to the college savings is tax-free growth. And you have the most amount for growth early on. So to me, see the 529s early, give that money a chance to grow.
Yeah, but that's also when you know your kid the least. So and you're less likely to
but again,
know. How do you know if your infant is going to go to university? You just don't know. So
yeah, but they don't have to get the money out of the 529. Time and time again, we've talked about the flexibility to use that money for private education, for vocational schools, in lieu of scholarships, in lieu of military service. And if none of those apply, then you can put the money now in a Roth IRA for the kid. There's limitations. The point is, yeah, okay, back to the same thing.
You're jumping through hoops though. So, I just think bottom line is like,
which is big for $250,000. If you're saving $250,000, I guess most of the families that I work with, they have maybe a little bit of a dual goal. I want to set aside money for my child. I want to make sure they're in a good position. I don't want it to be totally siloed with no flexibility in college savings. So they may do a degree of both, right? Some money in a 529, not to overfund it, with enough flexibility so that we can position that money to other children or move that money around, because there's all sorts of flexibility with that. And then at a certain point, talk about saving that money in a brokerage account. And then if the family is, ultra high net worth, there's other gifting strategies that can be really impactful for the kids. But that's probably another topic
Yeah,
conversation. So
when you're talking about family wealth and generational wealth, it's a totally different dynamic. This is more for like the mass affluent. You
well, I
know,
don't
you're
know about that. I mean, I have a lot of clients in, let's say, the $3 to $10 million range where this
Mhm.
is really impactful. And I have a lot of young clients that are in their 30s that have saved well and themselves have pretty good financial habits, and they want to put their kids on a good foot forward, not necessarily for college, but to give their kid enough security to be able to go and make decisions and drive their life in a way that's not so dependent on short-term thinking, which, as somebody that teaches young people and pays attention to what 22-year-olds are focused on in their job offers, time and time again, the number one thing that they're telling me about when they tell me about their job offer is the pay rate. They're
Mhm.
focused on the salary. And I'm not saying it's not important to make money. Salary can be meaningful, but when you're 22 years old, that first job, it's not about your salary. It's about your experience, right? You're learning. And to be able to give your child the ability to not have to take a job because of an extra $5,000 of salary in the job offer, but be able to think long term about how that job impacts their skill set and what that means for their future, I think is meaningful.
Brent, I've got a real world example I'm gonna throw at you. Just this past week, I was talking with someone on Teams. She works for a technology provider we use, and I got to talking to her about my newsletter, which kind of was a little bit of on this topic, a little dissimilar. But um, she asked me this question. She said, "Ben, what advice do you have for me for my daughter? I spent all this money, my money, so it was in her name, not her daughter's name. It was in her name." To go to university. I think she got her pharmacist degree. I can't remember. It was a technical degree. All right. The daughter graduates, fails. She's a bartender. She just wants to bartend. She says, "What do I do with that?"
Yeah, well, hopefully you don't have $150,000 hanging it out in a UTMA for her.
Or a 529 plan would be even worse.
I disagree. The 529 plan, not to get down into some, but 529s, again, you retain control. It's your account with the kid's name on it. You can move that
Here's
529
the thing,
to a
Brent.
different kid.
If it is in a UTMA account, she would see it as her money. She probably would have thought twice before spending all that money on a degree that she hated and a career field that she hated. But also it plays into your point, which is sometimes young people, they get too fixated on the starting salary, on the current income. Point in case here in my own life, going through college, I worked as a waiter. And I think the first year, this is back in 2006, when I graduated. I think the first year I graduated, I made something like $60,000, which was crazy to think about, just in cash tips and salaries and all, or hourly pay. Um, I didn't start making that again until well after 2013.
Well, and we could have a whole other
Yeah,
podcast on, I have a theory around what's called waitress syndrome, which
yeah.
is you get used to this higher level of money with a lower cap on
Mhm.
earnings potential, and it's hard to really step away from that. But that's, I think, your point on maybe if she had felt like it was her money, she
Mhm.
wouldn't have used it on the college. I don't think that, I, I really don't think the name on the statement is what drives that. Okay. I think it's really more driven by the conversations you have with the kid. I think all of the visual stuff, you can give the kid view access to it. You can name the account the kid's name. The only thing that's different is the tax form and the statement are going to have your social security number on it. Right. And so I guess what I'm advocating is the upside of retaining just that little bit of control, not for the sake of trying to, miser your children, but for the sake of keeping your relationship with your kids
Mhm.
in good standing, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you have to make where you feel like you should or shouldn't or whatever. However, you don't want to be in the position where they're blowing the money. You may or may not support it. And if you don't support it and they're really blowing the money for something bad, what do you do? we can argue over the morality of that situation. That's just the situation that you might end up in. Be aware, right? Now, back to the client situation that you were explaining.
Mhm.
I really think that is a conversation that starts earlier.
I agree.
And by the way, I think you do a great job of this in the
Mhm.
conversation you highlighted with your son. I'm in a weird spot with my kids because my daughter's just, she's 5 and
Mhm.
she understands money enough to realize like she needs money to buy toys,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
But she doesn't quite understand the concept. Like, I mean, admittedly, I worry about her a little bit. She's constantly like, I want to get some money so that I can go buy a toy. She has no interest in saving. It's like, how much money do I need for that toy? All right, great. I'll go make that money. And then the second I have that amount of money, I'm blowing it on the toy. So like, as a parent, I have to think about how do I teach her, there's 3 categories typically. There's spend, there's save, and there's give. Right. And so how do you teach your child to balance those three priorities? And you're further along in that than I am.
Yeah, I think that really it's key to just know your kids. You have to know them, and if you don't take the time to know them and understand what their motivations are, what their desires are, I do agree with you. It would be foolish to put a bunch of money in a UTMA and just cross your fingers and hope it all works out. So what I'm doing, I understand that it's a little bit like playing with dynamite. Dynamite's very powerful. It's a powerful tool, but it's also potentially dangerous. And I think that's your point. I think you're taking a more conservative tact um, by maintaining or encouraging clients and to maintain a large degree of control over that capital. Um, I'm personally thinking I'm in favor of curating an environment where you're not getting them enough to self-destruct, but it's enough to really go through some suffering and feel that pain if they make bad decisions. And it takes some discipline, and I understand myself well enough to where if I left that money in my name, I probably wouldn't be I would be reticent to allow them to make mistakes. I would try to control it. I just know myself and I know that's what I would do. So, forcing this money into my kids' names is a way for me to kind of like remove myself from that.
Well, because again,
Mhm.
by the way, um, you have 4 kids
Mhm.
and they go to school that costs you money. And worth the dollar amount that you're talking about, if you did need the control, you could take it out. Right. For a lot of the clients that we work with, I think what's
Mhm.
hard is you get a family that's in their mid 30s and has done a good job of increasing their income. And now they're making, $500,000 a year or something
Mhm.
like that. And they've got young kids. It's actually fairly easy for them to save $500 a month or something like that. And I don't, a lot of times it's hard to conceptualize like, what are you going to do? Because again, we did the math at an 8% rate of return, saving $500 a month gives you over $200,000 saved for that kid when they're, 18 years old. I'm not telling you how to think about that because that's a personal decision, but I am telling you to close your eyes and put yourself in that position and think about how you would handle that.
Well, what I'm inclined to do, this is the approach that I like, and then we can close this because we've been talking for well over an hour, and I appreciate everybody listening in on this. But uh, I personally like using, if saving for your kid's future is a goal, I like using a multi-prong approach, which includes a little bit in a 529 plan. I think they are overrated, but they're still useful tools. And I think that, as you said, there's enough flexibility in these things to where, so long as you don't overfund them, you're very unlikely to pay penalties, even if none of your kids go to higher education. But you can't overfund these things. So I like to use UTMA accounts for the reasons that I've described already. A little bit into 529 plans because especially if you have multiple kids, it's very likely that you're going to be spending a good amount on higher education tuition, at least on one of them, possibly all of them. And then the remaining balance, whatever you're targeting, should be invested in your name in a non-qualified account because that gives you maximum flexibility. Here's an example. Let's say I've daughter A and son B. All right, so daughter A, needs $200,000 for education. Son B doesn't, because, maybe he's going to become a master carpenter. All right, now you have $400,000 all in 529 plans. That's problematic. Now you have $200,000 in 529 and $200,000 non-qualified. Now it's not problematic. So you just want to have a multi-pronged approach that maximizes flexibility, so you can still maintain that egalitarian household. That's important to foster good, high quality relationships with your kids. Because I'll tell you one thing, man, money can destroy family ties. I'm seeing it happen right now. I've seen it happen multiple times. So, you want to be fair to your kids, even the one that's not behaving well. Because things have a way of changing.
And I agree with the multi-prong approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the right way to do it. The UTMA account is for financial behavior. It's essentially keeping your kid from being debanked. What's the opposite of debanking? Banking. So I mean, it's getting your kid tied into the banking system, the financial system. It's letting the kid learn how to deposit a check, how to see the balance go up, even if it's not about growth, right? And I'm not advocating there's not value to it. Just like anything else, the value's biggest at the beginning, and then it starts to
drop.
What
you're saying, Brent, is I've convinced you.
Well, I don't. I came into this thinking about this from a lot of the clients that I work with. When we talk about saving for kids, we're projecting, saving. It's not that we're necessarily saving for college, but that conversation often starts with like, what would college cost by the time my kid is college age? And then from there we can, pivot, but it's never $10,000. I mean, we're talking about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars for these kids. And so I think having a multi-prong approach in the sense that some of it's for, total return, right? Like maybe the UTMA account should be in cash in the sense that its balance shouldn't be very big and it should be at the bank and it's teaching the kid about banking, the investments, but don't put, I mean, again, back to our core premise, or the first thing we said, don't leave this money in cash. If your kid's not touching this money for a long period of time, if your goal, I don't care whether it's education, house, business, give your kid an early retirement, whatever it is that the money is for, if it's long-term money, don't sit it in cash.
Well, that example you gave of $100 a month for 18 years was $50-some thousand.
Yeah. So in the example, $100 a month, starting in 2000, ending in 2018, it's $1,200 a year. I did not inflate that number. Over the course of the 18 years, you save about $21,000. The money's worth about $53,000.
So, and if you left it in the bank account, it's worth $21,000.
$21,000.
Yeah.
And, if I took that out further, I mean, let's say you don't want to save for college and give this money to your kid when they're 18, but you instead want to use this money to help them buy their first house, right? I think the average first-time home buyer right now is like in their late 30s, but let's just pretend that your kid's going to buy their house when they're 30 years old. If I take that same math and I go back to 1990 and I end it in 2020, okay, and by the way, I'm picking these timeframes as I normally do because we cover one of the worst decades in market history in 2000 to 2010. Okay, there were two 50% drawdowns in the stock market over that decade. So nobody could pick on me for cherry picking a great time. But if you started in 1990, and none of this is inflation adjusted, and you started saving $100 a month for XYZ purpose, and you did that all the way through 2020, when your kid's 30 years old, you would today have contributed a total of about $31,000, and your total balance would be over $125,000. $125,000 is a decent chunk of money. And by the way, if you have a good financial advisor, it's pretty straightforward to be able to gift your kid $125,000, right? So it can be gifted to them at that point in time. You could gift it to them sooner than that if you want them to have the money in their 20s. I mean, but totally up to you. Point being, it doesn't take, you don't have to save thousands and thousands of dollars a year to give your kid $100,000 at 30 years old to start a business, buy a house, XYZ, name a thing.
Yeah. Right. Always good information from you. So this has been a fun topic to talk about, a little contentious at times, but I think you and I are both in agreement on the major key things. And I do see your point of view, and I think you see a little bit of mine. And hopefully, for those listening, you understand where we're both coming from, and can not necessarily lean one way or the other, but hopefully you can garner good ideas from everything that we've shared here today. So, if you have any additional questions about this topic, please encourage you to reach out to us. All our information's in the show notes, so you can reach out to Brent or myself. Happy to talk to you one-on-one.
Thanks, man.
Opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risks, including the potential loss of principal. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Advisory services offered through National Wealth Management Group, LLC.